So today I'll be talking about what happens when we actually succeed, which for me is kind of a foregone conclusion because I'm very optimistic about this particular project. I think it's, I think we're right, and I think we'll make the whatever will be required to make it happen legally and politically. So being a futurist, of course, I like to think, okay, what are we going to do after the fact? So basically this is going to be an exercise in thinking it through. I'm not going to pretend even for a moment that this is complete and thorough. This is just kind of some brainstorming and just setting the table for the kinds of things we might expect, particularly in the short term, but also perhaps some medium term and some long term things as well. And looking at across the various domains, the social, political, ethical, legal, and medical realms as well. So just to very briefly, some questions that I just posed, like what's going to happen to animals that are currently in captivity or those in the wild? What's going to, how could this potentially harm humans in some way, particularly our health when it comes to the lack of medical testing, let's say, that will arise from some of this, and potentially to other non-human animals as well. So the first thing that we can expect will be some serious ramifications to the entertainment industry by virtue of their extraction from zoos, from marine parks, of course, and from circuses and the like. And what's going to happen both is already happening now and it will certainly happen afterwards and during this process is how disruptive this will be to the entertainment industry as well. And they will fight back. They're going to be fighting for their lives. And this is already happening, like I mentioned, with the airing of Blackfish, which was this documentary about the mistreatment of orca whales. The SeaWorld's VP came out in an opinion editorial in CNN. I'll just read one paragraph from his article just to give you an idea of the tone and the kind of approach that they're coming here with. It says, "The 3 years since Dawn's death have seen the emergence of individuals who have chosen not to honor her memory, but rather to use the events of February the 24th, 2010 to advance their own interests. Some seek commercial gain. Others seek to forward a political or philosophical agenda. Still others appear to be engaged in self-promotion." So heaven forbid that we would actually engage in some politics and some philosophy about these matters, amongst other things. So I'm not going to read the entire quote, but that basically desperate times are now starting to call for desperate measures, and they're going to start to play hardball when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Like I said, they're literally going to be fighting for their lives. But it's going to be a losing battle, and eventually, as has already happened in India, for example, in India you can't have dolphins in theme parks anymore. And they've in principle kind of enacted a kind of a dolphin personhood. By saying principle because it's actually not codified in any of the books, but maybe if they should get there, they might actually set the precedent before we do here in North America, which would be interesting. And of course, there will be a trickle-down effect as well, and some might they will actually argue that there's going to be a kind of slippery slope and effect here. So we could see this impact should, again, we expand this beyond, let's say, cetaceans and great apes and elephants and so on, that we could see this impact horse racing. For example, right now, of all of the thoroughbred racing events, like the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, the Belmont, half of them have seen lethal breakdowns since 2005, which is absolutely atrocious. So that's going to be one of the first targets as well, I think. Dog racing could be impacted. But then there's going to be an emerging problem about those sorts of sports or activities where animals might actually appear to be enjoying themselves, such as frisbee, dog frisbee, and those sorts of events. Maybe equestrian polo is arguable that those animals are actually enjoying themselves. Okay, I missed some slides here. Okay, so medical testing. So obviously we were going to see the end of medical testing. Initially I would suspect it'll be amongst the great apes, and again, like we're already seeing this happen. The National Institutes of Health has already been mentioned, recently decided that nearly all of the 451 chimps that are currently held in government research facilities are to be retired from active duty and relocated to federal sanctuaries, which I'll get into a little bit in just a bit. There's going to be 16 research projects that will just shut down outright, but 3 are going to be allowed to continue. Projects that address immunology and infectious diseases. So it's very likely that research in hepatitis C in particular will be allowed to progress. No other animals, say scientists, will provide these kinds of useful models for this kind of research. Needless to say, research will continue to infect the chimps with these sorts of strains. So aside from the ethical considerations, the committee justified its report by citing an Institute of Medicine report showing that smaller mammals like mice have become more effective for biomedical work. Now that being said, as we work to protect, for example, the great apes from this sort of experimentation, and as research scientists are progressively finding that mice are wholly inadequate for a lot of the models that they're trying to establish, there has been a disturbing there's a trend now toward experimenting more on monkeys. And in particular, there was an article in Scientific American recently where someone was making the case that they should start to create genetically modified monkey models to more closely approximate human behavioral disorders, things like schizophrenia, neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So what's happening here is the humanization of animal models, which is obviously disturbing unto itself. But what's more disturbing, of course, is the fact that they're actually creating this level of psychological distress in monkey models. So this is definitely something that has to be watched. But again, why I bring this up in terms of the consequences is that certain avenues of research shut down, different avenues will be sought as a consequence. And I was talking to Lori Marino about this over lunch. Another possibility is they will be forced, therefore, to move to machine models and simulations, which at first will be benign and fine. And by the way, I'm a full supporter of this, that they should actually move as much experimentation as they can to simulations. But once any kind of subjectivity is introduced by those machines, such as consciousness and so on, then we now have moral considerations to obviously to be cognizant of. Okay, so yes, another point I want to make is that it's clear that the committee, though, the NIH, they do want to play it safe by halting all research on chimps, but they're recommending that 50 chimps be maintained in a colony should their services be required in the future. And what they're thinking is that it has something to do, I think, with the threat of a pandemic or a health crisis. So let's say SARS or something really nasty suddenly makes its way through the human population. They've got 50 chimps just sitting there, in a holding area that, ready to go, now we can work on them. Again, this is NIH, so even though that they've kind of eliminated the testing on the great apes, they've set aside the provision for this sort of contingency. And their guidelines set some stringent rules on for new proposed studies, including the need for independent committees to evaluate efficacy and safety of future research. These chimps, by the way, are going to be moving to, many of them, to the Chimp Haven, which is a federal sanctuary in Louisiana, which is, again, tropical-esque, so again, at least the environment is more to their liking. I was concerned to hear that there's actually a sanctuary in Montreal. I didn't know that, and it makes me kind of wonder about that. Until kind of like personhood legislation is passed, and even I think even after the fact, I still think I'm very cynical and very pessimistic about the court's willingness to uphold these laws, still when it comes to the protection of these animals. What I'm saying is that I don't imagine that they will enforce the ban on animal testing during a serious outbreak. Like I'm imagining a very, very serious pandemic. I really do think that they would trump any kind of legislation that we throw down just to justify it because of the primacy that humanity still holds, and just because of this exalted place that we seem to still think that we have. I'm hoping that I'm wrong, but that's my kind of, I suspect that will happen. So that's the NIH, and I just very briefly want to talk as well about, there's already a reaction now to the Non-Human Rights Project and Stephen Wise's initiative. And so, for example, scientists are now obviously hearing about this, and they're starting to flip out a little bit because now a lot of their research was going to, if they're successful, it's going to come to a grinding halt. So this is, I'm going to just read you a couple of quotes from Science Insider. So Frankie Trull, the president of the National Association for Biomedical Research in Washington, says her organization will fight any attempts at personhood in the courts. Chimpanzees, she notes, are important models for behavioral research, as well as for developing vaccines against viruses like hepatitis C, assigning rights to animals akin to what humans would be chaotic to the research community. So chaotic to the research community, exactly. And then in regard, one of the plaintiffs is being in the case is they're testing locomotion, and that work is being done by Susan Larson at Stony Brook, and she says that chimpanzees, they shed light on the origin of bipedalism in humans. She says she's very shocked and upset by the lawsuit. She says the chimps live in an indoor enclosure comprised of 3 rooms, about the size of an average bedroom, plus every room where they can climb, hang, and jump from ladders and tree trunks. Quote, "Everything I do with these animals I've done on myself," she says. "I understand that animal rights activists don't want these animals mistreated, but they're hampering our ability to study them before they become extinct." So these are the different approaches. Okay, so there's also going to be now the issue of rehabilitation. Again, what should happen once we are successful? So as already noted, they're going to be relocated to sanctuaries. The NIH set up some really nice guidelines. Groups that contain no less than 7 members. A minimum 1,000 square feet of space to move and climb, outdoor access to all weather conditions, opportunity to forage for food and build nests. By the way, currently in the United States, there are no labs that meet those criteria, not one. The question is, who's going to pay for all this? Who's going to pay for the sanctuaries? Who's going to pay for the rehabilitation of all these animals? And who's going to be accountable for the upbringing of the animals? So, I mean, in many cases, they're going to require special attention, particularly for the physical and psychological trauma that they've had to undergo. So, in fact, many of them are, in fact, depressed and traumatized. After 15 to 20 years of this type of confinement and testing, many of them have lost their capacity to play or relate to other chimps. And even once they're liberated, many of them keep their distance from others. They rock back and forth obsessively. They pace back and forth. They pull their own hair. They compulsively eat their own vomit. So there's already one group looking to kind of get ahead on all of this. Very small pilot study. They just took 5 liberated chimpanzees, I believe it was. Yes, it was chimps. And this has been Europe. This is the work being done by Godlieve Kranendonk and a psychiatric professor, Martin Bruin. They administered SSRIs. So they gave 5 chimps SSRIs, just like a normal human application, and to see what would happen. And sure enough, it actually started to work. So speaking to the BBC, Kranendonk shared the results. Quote, "Suddenly the chimps woke up. It was as if they were zombies in their enclosures, and now they are happy, playing with each other. They are chimps again. That was really nice to see," end quote. The playfulness, she said, had been restored. So after 6 and 8 weeks, their behavior started to very much improve. And the idea here is not that this is a permanent solution. This is meant actually as a short-term solution, just to kind of kickstart them back into being chimps. And for example, one of the chimps, Kenny, responded best of all to the treatment. He's now the clown of the group, entertaining the others and initiating play. So it's actually wonderful results from just a pilot study of 5 chimps. Now, what I find this interesting on a number of levels, not least of which that it shows how similar their neurological structures and emotional structures are to our very own. If you can give them a human-specific SSRI and it has a very similar effect on them, what does that tell you about their state of consciousness, their state of mind? They clearly have similar emotional and psychological responses. Now, who should pay for all this? I'm going to basically lay it out and say that, well, definitely the state should chip in, and we had some interesting conversations about that this weekend in terms of state accountability, in terms of this kind of patronship. But I also think that the institutions and the firms and the companies and the private individuals who had these animals confined and that were abusing them in the first place should be the ones that should be held accountable for and be made to compensate their rehabilitative efforts in that sort of way. Which kind of leads to the next sort of thing I want to talk about, which is that even after the fact, and now this is maybe a bit more speculative, but I wonder if there may be lawsuits launched on their behalf after the fact, for example, seeking reparations. So this could extend from individual cases right up through to class action suits, depending on how ambitious some lawyers might be. And when making the case, prosecuting attorneys will note that, hey, look, yeah, this animal has been finally legally recognized as a person, but it was always a person. So now you have to make good on all this. A counter argument to that could be, though, but there was a lack of scientific evidence. They did not know what they were doing because there was not enough scientific evidence to support the fact that they were persons. Okay, so running out of time a little bit. So there's also the issue of enforceability. I do want to talk about this. Just one other thing before I get to that, and just another issue here is what happens when somebody kills a non-human animal person by mistake. Let's take a fisherman, somebody's out by, off on the coast and catches a dolphin in their nets, that had no intention of doing so. What is the consequence here? Do we charge this person with second degree murder? Is it reckless endangerment causing death? Do we just give them a slap on the wrist? I actually don't have an answer to this question. I wouldn't mind having maybe some suggestions after the fact, but it could be as severe as something like a manslaughter type of a charge, because that's the severity of the negligence that was at play here. They have to find a way to not cause this kind of this problem. And there will also be geographical and political issues to consider as well, because what would be a crime here won't necessarily be a crime somewhere else, so to speak. And which is what I'm getting into here. For example, in 1986 ban on commercial whaling, some countries just simply refused to end it, even despite the fact that there is legislation in effect. So I would make a case for stronger pan-global organizations such as the UN and EU unions and other political unions to basically enshrine these protections and work to enforce them to make sure that the animals are safe. there's going to be a call to expand the personhood spectrum beyond the initial scope here. We're talking great apes, along with like the Stephen Wise's group, great apes, cetaceans, and elephants. But you can see that there will be a call for extending it to just beyond that particular group, and rightly so. So, for example, Mark Spivak has done work where he's trained dogs to be able to withstand and be patient inside of fMRIs. You can make a case this is actually ethically okay because they're cool with it, and it's actually being done to further their interests. Because what he's actually trying to study and show people is that they have very human-like capacities in terms of their emotional responses. By the way, they give them earmuffs to protect them against the loud volumes, because it's like 95 decibels inside of an fMRI scanner, and it literally took them months to train the dogs to be able to sit inside the scanner like that. Don't want to spend too much time on animal accountability. I really don't think we should hold animals responsible for their actions. These are, as we've discussed ad nauseum this weekend, these are negative rights that we're talking about. Now, I would like to spend some time on this, and I'll gladly go into my Q&A time, Patrick. If I'm wrapping up here now. Okay. Now, some people argue that by including animals in human affairs like this, we run the risk of politicizing them in a way that's not in their best interest, that we're sucking them up into the world of human affairs and complexity, and that they'd be better off in a natural state. So it's kind of an argument from a naturalistic bias or naturalistic fallacy. And they would accuse us, and even maybe potentially some futurists, of kind of engaging in an interspecies colonialism, that we're interfering in affairs that are none of our business and might even be a bit self-serving. And I think we've discussed the issues of stewardship and obligation. So these are the kinds of conversations that will continue to have to be fleshed out and developed. And I'm wondering also, does non-human personhood preclude the need to uplift? And what I mean by this is, it's the speculative issue of augmentation and uplift. And wondering if we have the technologies that can improve the intelligence of a great ape, are we therefore actually obligated to do it? Now, just bear with me on this line. I'm not saying I'm necessarily correct in this thinking, but it's things that I'm thinking about right now. So one thing before I get into what I want to say is that we do run the risk of humanizing these animals when it comes to uplift, and like the accentuation of a human value or a human characteristic. So right now we kind of fetishize intelligence, for example. So we want to say we want to make apes smarter when it comes to, let's say, the IQ type intelligence, so logic, reasoning, mathematical skills, and so on. But it's not necessarily a value, let's say, that would be an elephant value. An elephant or a cetacean may value other traits like swimming, physical abilities like swimming ability, or even enhanced underwater duration, or communicative abilities, empathic abilities. So we shouldn't just think about human-specific values in terms of the kinds of ways we might modify animals in future. So why there may be some obligation is by looking at severely disabled humans. If we could cure a developmental disorder, we would probably do it. If we make the leap and suggest that a non-human person is lacking in traits that would further their ability for self-actualization and self-determination, to kind of pull them from the Darwinian paradigm, we should probably help them in terms of, and so we should be on the lookout for the best interest of the individuals of these species. So it may be incumbent upon us to help them in that regard. And just my last comment would be about kind of the abolitionist movement, which is the idea, this was touched upon yesterday, the kind of the end of predation. This is some really radical, deep futurism now, but the idea that we could rework the entire ecosystem such that we would put an end to all predation, we would put an end to all animal suffering, at least to the largest extent possible, and that we just have to rework the entire Earth in such a way where this kind of an ecosystem would be viable. It would be aesthetically still, I think, pleasing, however you want to put it. But these are kind of like, maybe this could be, you could argue an absurd, kind of an absurd conclusion, reductio ad absurdum, or it could be certainly where this line of argumentation will eventually lead us hundreds of years from now, centuries from now, or what have you. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.